Thank you all for coming today, and I hope that you'll find this information useful. It's been interesting to just over the last couple of weeks putting all this together again, just to spend the time and relive some memories from those days. And it was about 3 years ago that Lynn Radford encouraged me to take a look at getting involved. And after I said yes, I never looked back, and I can't imagine not being involved. So thank you, Lynn, for encouraging me to do so. So here's some of the things that we're going to talk about today: recruitment, screening and selection, our assignment being attaching specific people to specific roles, our orientation and training programs, scheduling the resources, the volunteer center, uniforms, how we supported our volunteers during the games, and our recognition event. I'm going to do the first part, and then it'll take about 10 seconds, I was told, and we'll just switch the mic over to Laura, and she'll do the last half. So here's how we got structured. There were 6 staff, and they came on at various times, right? We brought people on as they were required, and it would be the same with volunteers. I came on very early in the game, and then we brought on subcommittee leads, and so we had a lead team of volunteers, and from there they led specific committees. So we had a recruitment committee, we had an orientation and training committee, and on and on. So, and then they recruited members to come on again as need be. And that phased out closer to the games. About a year out, we brought on board reps from volunteer services to sit on the venue teams. And so we transitioned over to those lead positions. And then, of course, our 4,600 plus volunteers during the games. Recruiting, we did about 70 events, and that was across central Alberta. And we, from there, we started screening. And it was interesting, most people, especially throughout central Alberta, weren't really used to volunteering, applying to be a volunteer, that sort of thing, the way we had to handle it. So we had both written interviews and in-person interviews. So there's the numbers, 2,753 written interviews were requested, just over 2,100 were assessed, and we did 2,296 in-person interviews. So that's getting together one-on-one with people. And background checks. So there were a number of positions that we required background checks for. Leadership positions. Those positions that would have been actively involved with young people, right? So the sports people that came along, the athletes. And so we needed to make sure that we were getting vulnerable checks done. Bilingual. Canada's a bilingual country. We have 2 official languages. Our target was 10%. We had 928 bilingual people, and that's everywhere from basic to conversational to fluent. So we certainly met our and exceeded our 10%. Gender distribution. We were 60-40, female to male. So what were our diversity and inclusion? This was really critical to us, that we made sure that we made room and acknowledged that there's persons with disabilities that we could include. And so part of the application form, we asked people to self-identify. And from there, we trained people to be able to correctly and engage with those people to determine what were their needs. Did they have a support person? or not. Some did, some didn't. And then from there, how did we put them into positions that would best meet their needs and give them a meaningful time at the games? The challenge, not being aware of the support people, and we ran into that probably fairly close to the games time. And so the challenge became, if I was a person with disability and Laura was my support person, I needed to make sure we were both put in the same position and we were both scheduled at the same time. And when we didn't know that some people had support people, thankfully we found out in time, but it all worked out, but it was a challenge. Orientation and training. Our general games orientation, which was just that, how do we educate people in terms of just generally what can they expect? We did that in person to 2,811 of our volunteers. So that was pretty phenomenal. We gave people the option, do you want to do it in person or do you want to do it online? And I think starting out, we kind of thought that a lot of people would want to do it online, but that wasn't the case. Certainly, we had applicants from across the nation. We even had applicants from outside of Canada. And so obviously we needed the online as well. Role-specific training. So we had 2,000 participants in that. Obviously, once people have been put into a specific role, we needed to train them in that role. And from there, I could be a person that was doing food handling or working in the volunteer lounge. That would be different from one venue to the next. So we did venue orientation for everybody as well. And that again was approximately 2,000 participants. Obviously there were some people that the first time they got to the venue was for their very first shift. But we made sure that we had a process in place. They showed up, they knew where to go, and were given their orientation at that time. The development and delivery of all the orientation and training was about 1,000 hours. So that was quite intensive. Assignment. When it came to assigning people, we had 14 venues, 3 geographical locations. So we were here in Red Deer, we were in Calgary for artistic swimming, and we were out in Kananaskis for some of the skiing events. And the total roles required were 140 individual roles. So let's take a look at some of our successes and some of the challenges. When it came to recruiting, like I said, we did have a presence across central Alberta, so we tried to choose events where we knew there'd be lots of people. The retention of our leadership volunteers, I was really amazed and very thankful, quite frankly. We retained between 90 and 95% of our leadership volunteers, meaning once they came on board, they stayed with us. And lots came on board 1.5 to 2 years prior to games, so very thankful for that. And our open houses, Laura's going to talk a little bit more about that, but they were very successful. Our challenges, it was a heavy draw on resources to go to these events. There's setup, there's the event itself and tear down, and just making the arrangements so that we could be at these events. The budget, not all events you attend and want to set up a table are free. And so that became a bit of a challenge. And online applications, so when it came to recruiting, just getting them filled out, getting people to respond in a timely manner, that became a challenge. Screening and selection. So just keeping in mind to begin with that selection here means approval to volunteer, because not everybody that applied was approved, but selection means just that, you're approved to be a volunteer. So the successes, We train volunteers to be able to do the in-person interviews, to do the review and assessment of online questionnaires. And we just had a phenomenal group of people, very dedicated, that spend a lot of hours in our volunteer centers doing just that. Custom questionnaires. We each, so the questionnaires that we sent out, they were different. It depended on what role you were applying for. Our in-person interviews went really well because it also gave us a time to talk a little bit more in general about the games, because everybody that walked through those doors and sat down for an interview, we knew when they left they were going to be an ambassador for the games, so it really helped to be able to do that. Some of our challenges: volunteer responsiveness, trying to set up in-person interviews, communicating back and forth by email with people and getting them to respond to us. You know, everybody leads busy lives, but it did impact us. Confusion over different requirements. So we quite often would have friends that would apply together, and so one friend would get an online questionnaire and the other friend we might request an in-person interview. So all of a sudden there's confusion. How come you get an interview and I don't? Or how come you're bringing me in? What's wrong? But if I was applying for a leadership position, someone was going to interview me in person. But if I wanted to be a driver, transportation driver, I would get a questionnaire, right? So that became confusion amongst the applicants about how come. Having processes in place before the portal opened. So many of you would probably remember our portal opened exactly 1 year prior to the games. February 15th, 2018 is, we had the big 1 year out event. Our portal, which was the application system, opened up at the same time. Once that opened up and people started applying, the excitement of it all, the expectations were high as well. So I applied and I haven't heard anything. Okay, when did you apply? Well, I sent it in last night and I still haven't heard anything, right? So you love the passion and the excitement, but it did create its own set of challenges at the same time. Assignments, our successes. Communication, training, and scheduling were a lot more focused. So once somebody was approved to be a volunteer and we actually assigned them to a specific position, then the path forward for them was a lot more focused and it made it easier. Very labor intensive, as you can imagine. And Laura's going to be giving you some additional numbers which will help you understand some of those challenges. But with over 4,600 people to look after, all those venues, all those locations, took lots of hard work. Again, volunteer responsiveness, sometimes it was difficult. And there's a lady in the room, her name is Candy, and she spent a lot of hours following up, as did others. And requests for reassignment. And so sometimes you would go along with people. They would go to their role-specific training and do all of that, and you'd get them into a venue. This was pre-games, and then they said, well, I don't think I want to do that. I think I want to do something else. And so obviously we want to accommodate as best we can, but it becomes a challenge when you're dealing with those kinds of numbers. Orientation and training, so the successes. As you saw by the numbers before, the attendance and response was excellent. And during even the general orientation, it just gave people a chance to talk to each other, meet a lot of people, and start to ask us a lot of questions. So those were great. We took a lot of photographs for the accreditation. They need their pictures taken, and so it gave us an opportunity to do that. The development of online training for general orientation, again, that worked really, really well because we had lots of people that couldn't make one of the in-person sessions. And we centralized invitations for role-specific training and venue orientation. So it didn't matter what they were assigned to, where they were going to be. The invitations went out from a central location. And that really, really helped. The challenge, again, logistics. Anytime you're dealing with those kinds of volumes of people, logistically, it's a challenge. Thankfully, I think it was pretty seamless and transparent to the people that came to those sessions. I don't think it was mentioned a couple of times earlier today that there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes that you never see, but that's good. But it's still a lot of work behind the scenes. And an online training program that does become difficult to do, but we did it. And I think when I look back to the hours that we spent, and Laura's going to be talking about the recognition event, but I was amazed at the comments that I heard there. And I mean, we've heard lots today, just again and again and again. And ever since then, if I run into somebody that was part of the games, oh, that was the best time ever. And I can't believe that we pulled all that off. And I wish it never ended. And it's okay it ended. But we heard that, especially at the recognition event, and Laura will talk about that people loved it. They worked hard, but they loved it. Whoops, I'll just, whoops, can I go back? Whoops, no, it's not gonna let me. Okay, sorry. I got finger. Oh, okay. Sorry. Laura's gonna take it from here.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, so I did want to touch a bit more on assignment. I know the slide says scheduling, but assignment and scheduling, we deliberately separated the two activities when we went through the volunteer journey. So it was that a volunteer would get assigned to a role. So it's really important, what we found was to spend a lot of time getting down to the very specifics of the role. You know, lots of times you start really big, everybody thinks this is how many you need, but it's whittling it down and being really clear on what is required of each role and how they're gonna interact with each other. So when you end up with your final number of roles, it is assigning somebody to a role. We did not assign them to a venue. For context, we did work with a system, it's called GEMS Pro. And so with any volunteer management system you work with, there's going to be pros and cons. In our case, with the system, if you assign somebody to a venue, it would make it really difficult for them to be scheduled to multiple venues. So we elected to assign someone to a specific role, but then use the system to do scheduling in a different way, so it opened up a bit of flexibility. So you can see from the numbers, even though you might have around 120 roles across all functional areas, we ended up building in about 14,000 different shifts. So you'll see on the second line, the number of the total number of shifts that were scheduled was over 28,000 shifts. And that's because you'll have multiple people assigned to one shift. So if it's a driving shift, you might have 45 drivers assigned from 4 p.m. until midnight. So it is a very manual process to build in all of the shifts into the system, but it's worth it. It provides clarity to your volunteers and facilitates the process of accepting and declining shifts that I'll talk a bit more about. So kind of a staggering number. This is just at games time. It doesn't reflect any of the pre-games hours. 171,000 plus hours were given by the volunteers during that 2-week time frame, and a little bit on the commissioning and a bit on decommissioning at either end. But that's pretty amazing. And when we looked at our shift length, we did look at having a minimum. So our minimum shift length was 4 hours. We did have some shift lengths that, on average they were between 4 and 8 hours. But, as Edie mentioned, we did have some satellite locations. So you've got Calgary, you've got Nikiska, where it's just you show up and you're working the full day. So there could be some longer shifts depending on how the sport itself was being delivered. So some successes with scheduling. So volunteer services did work collaboratively with all of the other functional areas throughout the process. So it wasn't volunteer services who decided everything about shifts. It was driven by those functional areas. Obviously, a lot has to do with the sport schedule. And so you have to really have that open and continuous communication to make sure that what's being designed is going to support the sport delivery and the functioning of the venue. And we also had a really solid change management process. So we did really operate by spreadsheet. If you saw the volumes and volumes of spreadsheets, but they were really critical to making sure that everybody was on the same page, and that you could have a tool to collaborate with each other. But the sports schedule in our case could change all the way up until the fall of 2018. So you're still making those adjustments. But if you don't have a good change management process, it doesn't flow through all the way to making those changes in the system and letting the volunteers know that, your shift has now needs to start a half hour earlier, right? And when you're working with people, you don't want them to be there and sitting and waiting because you didn't inform them that their shift is actually delayed by, an hour. People are making arrangements to be there. So having that change management process in place, where if a shift needed to change after a certain point in time, an actual request had to go through and it flowed through a series of steps, was really critical to keeping us on track. Otherwise, it can become very disorganized pretty quickly. So challenges, I would say the accept and decline process is a bit of a challenge. So the way our system worked was based on how the volunteers had filled in their application on their availability, then you would offer them shifts. So you would try and fit it in with what they said they were available for, and then you would notify the volunteer that they had shifts that they needed to review, and they could accept or decline. But there was a lot of follow-up required to get people to take a look at that, and then once they've declined it, try and figure out, okay, we've given you shifts that align with what you said you were available. How do we now get you something that, maybe that's changed? So there is a lot of back and forth, but again, that accept and decline is so important to each functional area, knowing if they're going to have a volunteer there or not, and reporting back to those groups to say, yes, 100% of your shifts have been accepted versus we've offered 100%, but at this point we're at maybe 25% accepted. So to know really what it's going to look like at the venue on that day. Sports schedule changes can be a challenge for that same reason that I mentioned. It's very impactful. So it hits a lot of different aspects of the volunteer experience and the overall scheduling. So that can be a challenge, but if you have a process in place to manage that, it makes it a lot more seamless. We also had a great each functional area, we kind of called them sort of the scheduling ninjas. They would get together and they would schedule their functional areas, because you're in the thousands of volunteers. So trying to schedule that many shifts, you need to engage a lot of people. We had well over 50 people doing scheduling. So you're having to train those people how to schedule within the system, and making sure that they're scheduling only those people who've been assigned to them. Otherwise, you can get into some challenges with, oh, well, I know so-and-so, so I'm going to schedule them for my area. A little bit of that cherry picking. So we were trying to really prevent that. And also, if you don't kind of manage that, then people can end up with shifts across all roles, 10 different venues, and that's pretty confusing for the volunteer. But due to a few things, we did want to centralize the scheduling so that we could fill up schedules and really manage it better, but we really needed to continue to engage the functions in scheduling for a lot longer than planned. So the Volunteer Center. So successes, we did open 2 centers. So we opened the first one in April of 2018, and that was having a physical location that was actually off-site from where our head office was. The first one that we worked in the Ingham McKee building over on Bremner, and it was great. It was a smaller space, it was a shared space, but it really allowed us to start doing those in-person interviews and have a dedicated location to meet with volunteers. They could come in for support. As much as we live in an online environment, we found that, our volunteer base was a high-touch base. They really liked that face-to-face interaction. We had a great group of dedicated volunteers, as Edie mentioned, who supported us. They came in, we recruited them to they'd be at the front desk, they would do reception, they would answer the phones, because again, you're with a small team of staff, so you can't do all the activities yourselves. You really have to grow your team to help do that. Our second center was in the old Sears building at Bauer Mall. So it was a very large space. It was great. It really allowed us to grow into it because your operations do grow. You start off with just more of that recruitment, screening, and selection function, but we knew it needed to grow to be our uniform distribution center. So you have to have the footprint to be able to do that. And the nice thing for us was that we could start off in a portion of the location doing our volunteer center activities and then be in the same space to do our uniform distribution. So that was a great location for us to be. Also, there's parking, it's free parking, it's easy for people to get to, it's familiar, it's fairly central, so there were a lot of really positives about the locations for both. Some of the challenges include the initial setup. I mean, you're quite literally starting a whole new operation center. And so that's amidst all the other activities that you need to do to manage a volunteer program. So the initial setup can be very time consuming. Staffing, again, you've got your core staff and that's supplemented by volunteers, but we wanted to make sure our hours were conducive to when people were going to come and see us. So, you're open on the weekends, you're open later in the evening. And so making sure that your team has the flexibility to meet those hours and that, you have that coverage. So focusing on getting the volunteers to support that is really important. Upkeep, again, it was a really big facility and your budget isn't always huge on things like cleaning and maintenance. And so you really start to take on a bit of different roles to make sure that it's always really clean and presentable. So that was a bit of a challenge with that particular location. Because one of the things that we actually looked at was across everything, what could we do to leverage the space? And so Edie talked about the training, the role-specific training. Well, we would host them at that location. So on the second floor, we had 2 different, training sessions going on at the same time and really tried to maximize that space. So it was just making sure that it was always clean, presentable for all the different functions that were happening. The other challenge, and just to keep in mind, is thinking through, that the whole logistics piece. You're bringing in thousands and thousands of boxes. Our uniforms were 5 pieces, and across, over 5,000 projected volunteers, that's a lot of pieces of clothing, and so you need a place to stage it, but you also need a place to store it. And depending on the shipping company, how do you actually get it off the truck and into the facility? So when you're thinking about your location, it's all those logistics pieces. So that you don't necessarily have to get into outside storage and implications of that. So loading and the shipping aspect were a challenge that we needed to work through to make sure that we could do that seamlessly. So this is just a snapshot of our uniform. It did affectionately get referred to as the Winnie the Pooh uniform, but the thing with volunteer uniforms is that they're intended to be both functional and really obvious, right? So sometimes people would come in and say like, ooh, it's not really my color. I don't like that. But when you explain to them that, well, is it warm? And that's what we heard resoundingly. It's the Winter Games. You want people to be warm. They were mega warm. People loved that. But it was also very clear who our volunteers were. You couldn't go and just buy this off the shelf. It was custom. It represented our branding. So it was really important to balance those. And time and again, we did hear people who love. You still see them around, and people loved the look. It looked great on television. It really popped. So there were lots of positive things there. We also distributed a volunteer handbook that was really comprehensive and intended to be a tool that people could use to put information and prepare them for their shifts. And so we got a lot of really positive feedback about the volunteer handbooks, and that was really well supported by our communications and marketing team and all the functions that needed to put information in there. The other thing, 5 minutes? I'll try and talk faster. The other thing that you need to potentially think through is if you have satellite locations. So we had Calgary and we had Nikiska. So you don't want to expect people to drive in to pick up their uniforms and their accreditation badge. So it was thinking through the logistics of how do we get to those volunteers. So we did a couple of different days of uniform distribution, but you're trying to forecast how many people can come, and it's all the logistics around that. So that can be challenging, but also really rewarding when the volunteers appreciate that you've made the effort to come to them versus them having to make a separate trip to you if you do have different locations. I won't talk a lot about accreditation. Accreditation for us was an entire program in and of itself. But with the volunteers, one of the challenges was getting people to upload their photos. So we found a really great process was having regular email reminders, but also have that, everywhere you are, you have a camera and you're taking photos and uploading them and helping people with that because you have to have it for the accreditation badge. So that was good. But yeah, that was something that needed to continuously be on the go. Games time support, so successes with the support of our sponsorship team and food services and the vendors they secured. We had a lot of great food for our volunteers. The satisfaction relative to the variety of food was high. At Games time, we also created an ombudsperson committee. This was a team that was separate and objective. If somebody had a concern with how something was handled, they could escalate it through the ombudsperson committee. So that was a success. We had 4 volunteers who are trained mediators. We did not need to use the ombudsperson committee. We were able to address anything up through the channel, but it was very nice that it was there and available. Also, shift change communication. We really wanted to make sure that we were proactive in communicating any shift changes with volunteers to enhance their experience. Challenges, establishing accurate numbers early enough to share for food ordering. That's tough because you're still refining all of your numbers, so that can be a challenge. And also meeting food preferences and dietary requirements. That can be a challenge across all the venues and making sure you have enough variety in those regards to address all the needs. Recognition, successes. We did have our volunteer recognition event, and it was very well attended. There was over 4,000 people who came, and it was incredible to see that many people so pleased with their experience and wanting to celebrate it together. We also had an exclusive volunteer pin as a recognition and a thank you, and we did keep to that. We had lots of people coming in the volunteer center trying to beg, borrow, and steal the exclusive gold volunteer pin. We just didn't give out a lot of them. We have the same number, but they really liked that aspect. Challenges, trying to predict how many people would come to the recognition event and having enough food. So that was a challenge. At times, definitely getting low on food because we had a lot more people than historically had come to those recognition events. And just event planning. So for us, because you can tell there's a lot of different components to the volunteer program, we were able to be involved, but at a point needed to ask our planning team to help us out to plan the volunteer recognition event. It's a whole undertaking in and of itself, which can be really difficult to balance while you're trying to get everybody in place for the games themselves. So thinking beyond your team and who else can assist with the planning of an event like that. Even though it's the volunteer recognition event, it doesn't necessarily have to just be the volunteer team that is planning it. The other thing I just wanted to mention, I know it's not on the slides, but it's also a good practice that we found was collaborating. So Volunteer Central is an organization in Red Deer, and in our application process, we asked if people would be okay with, their name being shared for future volunteer events, and that's a big part of legacy. So at the conclusion of the games, we were able to send, I think it was over 4,000 names to Volunteer Central to keep that, spirit and volunteerism going in the community. So it's, are there opportunities to engage with your local volunteer groups to help you with that programming? So I know we don't have a lot of time, but any questions? Yes.
You did make a comment about the province volunteers. Any idea how many people looks like Red Deer volunteers?
I have the exact statistics that we can share, but all told, so we ended up with actually, I think it was 4 to 6 out of country volunteers who came to do that. We ended up, I'd say about 100, would I be wrong on that, for out of province? At least 100. We had one gentleman who joined us from BC. He took a whole month off work. He had volunteered at the 2015 games. He worked in the volunteer center. He did opening, closing. He was all over it. He loved every minute, and he dedicated, he came out for over 3 weeks from BC to volunteer. So we had several out-of-province volunteers. So we do just have our contact EDNAX. I know we kind of flew through a few things, so if you do have questions, feel free to email us, and we're happy to answer any questions.
So as you can see, that's a complex venue, so big thanks to Laura and Edie for taking that one on. And certainly if you have individual questions for them, they'll be around after, but just in our effort to try to keep things on schedule and make sure we honor your time, we'll have you post them separately, and we'll move on to the next speakers.
Thank you very much, Laura and Edie. Yes.